Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of AntiCulture, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about this book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic by Rieff, subtitle and Uses of Faith After Freud. It's a very interesting book. It's an important book, I think. Most people have never heard of Philip Rieff. He's not, commonly discussed or anything like that. But he has had significant influence on some people that are commonly discussed. Like recently, there's been a resurgence of interest in Christopher Lasch. Christopher Lasch's books, the Culture of Narcissism and The Revolt of the Elites, they're both heavily influenced by Philip Rieff and the kinds of things that Philip Rieff says. For example, in this book, so for some reason, the resurgence of interest in Christopher Lasch is not translated into something like that for Philip Rieff himself, but I think that it should, and he's a very deep, serious thinker that deserves to be engaged with a lot more than he is. And he was a sociologist. He wrote this book in 1966. He also wrote The Mind of the Moralist. People debate about how much of it was written by his co-author, Susan Sontag, who was his lover and then wife, but I don't, I'm not going to engage with that, with that idea or that controversy. But he wrote Triumph of the Therapeutic. The Mind of the Moralist demonstrates a lot of like the conservative dimensions of Freud and psychoanalysis, and I think that that's another thing that people, particularly people on the right, sort of unfairly dismiss at injury to themselves ultimately, because there's a lot that is useful in psychoanalysis for understanding us, our situation, the world as it is, etc., and so forth. But so then he wrote Triumph of the Therapeutic in 1966, and the Triumph of the Therapeutic is a really interesting book. Later, he also wrote a trilogy, Sacred Order, Social Order, which I've begun but I haven't finished yet. And so the first volume of that I'm currently trying to read is about death works, and that's interesting stuff too. That's like more dense academic description of his sociological theory, whereas this book is about Freud and psychoanalysis and Freud's successors and a kind of radical cultural transformation that he thinks is taking place, in which we transition. He's got this concept of three worlds. The first world is, he thinks that all social order is grounded in sacred order, that cultures function to produce sort of interdicts and remissions, right? Controls and releases. It's a form of the self-regulation of behavior in society, right? So this is related to Freud too, where Freud in Civilization's Discontents, for example, says that repression is what buys civilization. That to have civilization, to have flourishing human culture of any kind, you have to have repression, right? And he thinks that it's necessary, Freud does. And so does Philip Rieff. But Philip Rieff thinks that we have these repressions, this regulation of behavior in society, these moral codes, right? These interdicts. And they're a form of kind of self-limitation of the gratification of our own desires and instincts and stuff like that as individuals. And he thinks that this framework, symbolic interdictions have to always be, or have always been, at least until now, grounded in some kind of transcendent, in some kind of sacred order. And that right now, we're moving out of we had the first world, which was like ancient Greece and stuff like that, this kind of like heroic mythological sacred order, right? Where, our norms and everything, or not ours, but their norms were grounded in this whole mythological system, right? And then you have the second order, in which or a second world in which you have like Christianity, for example, and you have, you know, the Bible and this monotheistic God, and there are these commandments and all this kind of stuff. And now we're moving into what he calls the third world, in which we're sort of doing away with the sacred order altogether, with the transcendent altogether. And that's the first time that that's ever been attempted. Because in the past you have these controls, the kind of modalities of control, in terms of the control of behavior and things like that. They're rooted in the transcendent so that they have some kind of meaning, that there's a purpose to them. So they function to solidarize all of us into a community with cohesive interests. We identify with each other's interests, etc. And so you have like the concept of sin, in which you're straying from this moral order, which has a divine or sacred origin, right? And then that's like experienced traumatically. You have guilt and shame and things like that. And it being tied into some like religious idea makes you buy into it more, right? And it gives it a purpose. It gives a purpose to your repression. You know, I'm not giving up on all of these elements of my individuality just so that I can, like, you know, see people at the grocery store or whatever. Like, there's a purpose to it. There's a meaning to it. You're ensorcelled in a web of meaning that is beyond you, that's bigger than you, you know. And so the social orders are grounded in these kind of sacred orders. And he has ideas. There's like conceptually, there's a lot of stuff in here that it's like sort of important to understand in order to talk about what he's saying is happening in the culture too. So I'll try to discuss a little bit of that. So like he has this concept sort of like Toynbee does, and we discussed in my Toynbee video, where like every society has some elite cadre, which is subject to mimetic energies from the masses. And it's the function of this group of elites to transmit the moral code, to transmit the system of, interdicts and remissions to the population, and to convey the transcendent purpose of those things and stuff like that. To embody doing it correctly, etc., to model it. Okay, and he thinks that cultures can't survive without elites in this way, and that our elite in our society today is really failing in that project because they're sort of revolting, like the revolt of the elites idea. They are engaged in a war on the controls, on behalf of permissiveness. There's a kind of libertinism where, we've had sort of articulated throughout the history of the West, right? We've gotten this bigger and bigger idea of like the autonomous individual. It's become more important. Individualism, individuality, individual expression. And so that's really embodied in our elites. And they're like, we're going to get rid of these, like this old Christian morality and these old traditions like the patriarchy and, all this kind of stuff. Like the idea of traditional marriages and families and sexual relations. We're going to just abolish all of these norms, abolish all of the controls, and instead, just like be you and do you and stuff like that. That's what our elite have been engaged in. They're producing what he calls an AntiCulture, which it produces death works. And the way that those things work is, it's music or books or movies or plays or whatever, all sort of cultural products no longer serve the purpose of inculcating this tradition, of transmitting tradition, but instead attack it. So you get like movies and TV shows about like priests molesting boys or whatever, and you get, you know, portrayals of fathers and men as bad, as, you know, as dumb and obsessed with like their authority, and they're like actually pitiful and blah 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 blah. You get like celebration of drugs and experimentation with sexuality and stuff like that. Like all of these cultural products are about actually attacking the culture. They function as a you know, critical pursuit of the annihilation of traditional culture. You know, so it's what he calls an anti-culture, and it produces these death works and stuff. And unfortunately for them, I mean, in our society, the masses, normal people, they're not as forward thinking in this way or whatever. And so, you know, he's like, they're engaged in this sort of like culture-wide deconversion therapy where, you know, they're trying to do that to all of us, to make all of us, you know, get rid of that. Like to just have permissiveness reign, period, you know. But, you know, there are problems with this, like, you know, just like unlimited transgressions, and if transgressions are ultimately successful and the controls are abolished, then transgression loses its meaning too. You know, just the whole of the world crumbles. Even rebellion, you know, can't be done anymore or whatever. We're just, you know, emptying out culture altogether. But anyway, so they all cultures in the past have used like what he calls commitment therapies, right? So like when you're doing confession and talking to a priest or something like that, you're engaged in like a commitment therapy because something has gone awry to some degree, and it's, you know, it's invariable. He thinks that this is a dialectical sort of process of controls and releases. You know, that society is always transforming in the sort of relative jurisdictional power of the controls versus the releases, etc. But like, so people have always like had conflicts with social controls, right? And so you've had like what are called commitment therapies, like a priest sort of functions as a commitment therapist to try to ensure that you are embedded in the communal purpose. He's trying to solve that problem for you, right? So that you can be brought back into the fold, back into society. Your life can become meaningful again with reference to the sacred order, etc. And then you get Freud and the development of the analytic attitude. And for Philip Rieff, Freud is kind of, you know, he perfectly embodies this idea of the analytic attitude and like the therapeutic in this new way, right? In which Freud's idea is like all commitment therapies fail. Like there's just always going to be this conflict between individuals and individual interests and everything like that, and my sense of well-being or my personal happiness or whatever. But that's all we should focus on. And every attempt by like the cultural superego to infringe upon that and to give me a communal purpose and stuff like that, he thinks these are all failures, and that the analytic attitude of neutrality, objectivity, is to sort of observe yourself as an object, to observe the way these things make you feel, anxieties that are provoked by them, etc. and so forth, so that you can not so that you can become committed again, right? But so that you can just like live better, like have some greater sense of happiness or something like that privately. Maybe modify your behavior in some way or whatever, if it's upsetting to you not to or whatever. You know, teaching you how to live without commitment, because he thinks that all these things are failures from here on, that every that religion is sort of is an expression of this psychological need for like an omnipotent father figure, et cetera, and so forth, right? So it's like it also constitutes this kind of war on the sacred order. In this book, he also discusses some of Freud's successors and the way that they have sort of been uncomfortable with this idea that Freud is able to just sort of refuse forever any attempt at ultimately bringing you back to a communal purpose, right? He's like obsession with my own personal happiness, sort of par excellence, right? But some of his successors, like we talked about in this book, like Reich or D.H. Lawrence and Jung. Yeah, why was I forgetting Jung? That, like, for example, Jung, he is engaged in this analytic attitude, right? But he's uncomfortable with the idea that you never are, that you're always going to be alone, that you're always just going to be self-interested, interested in your own happiness, just sort of trying to moderate your feelings with respect to demands that are placed on you by society that have no sacred origin or whatever. Jung is uncomfortable with that. And so he like tries to turn psychoanalysis once again into like a new kind of religion, to give you a new kind of communal purpose, in the sense that, we have this collective unconscious and there are these archetypes and we're all together. He tries to turn it into a kind of new religion. There are people who try to turn psychoanalysis into like, a kind of revolutionary socialism or whatever, right? There are all these people who aren't comfortable with remaining with what in analysis is called Freudian neutrality. This is a big... Nobody is now. I think I've discussed this before, but when I was working on my thesis, initially I was going to do transgender in psychoanalysis, and I eventually got scared of that. But when I was doing research for it, I noticed in PepWeb that it's like that transgender is a form of psychosis, etc., and so forth. That's what Freud says. That's what Lacan says. So all the psychoanalytic literature is like that, until basically, just one day, basically, everyone is like, it needs to be depathologized. It's totally normal. This was just sort of like a form of bigotry or whatever, etc., without sort of any argument or anything whatsoever. But it's just that psychoanalysis has been invaded by progressive politics, which we see quite a bit of in this book. And yeah, it's the Freudian neutrality and analysis today is basically gone. But so yeah, he investigates these people too, different kinds of successor ideologies to Freudian psychoanalysis, who aren't comfortable with like the totally therapeutic worldview ultimately, because because it's purposeless. There's no ultimate sense of gratification. There's no point to everything. My repression is meaningless. It's just like the whole purpose of everyone's life is just like to minimize the unhappiness that they experience having to go to work or whatever. It's not good enough. But so. He thinks that our society is, we have an anti-culture, and it's the first attempt to do away with the sacred order, basically. And that Freud is trying to kind of fill the gap here by saying, look, we can adopt this analytic attitude and analyze, the lack of commitment and, just try to focus on ourselves and kind of modulate our experience in some way to achieve a kind of greater sense of well-being while we're living in the abyss or whatever. And he's like, that's the kind of new ethos that it's all about. And we see this in our culture, that it's all about just like me and my happiness and do I feel good and, do you and live the way you want. Don't let anybody interfere with your bliss or whatever, and monitor your relationships to make sure you're not like engaged in, codependence, toxic relationships, blah, blah, blah. It's just this like, strict paying attention to the way we feel about everything going on in our lives, with the only objective being that, it should all just be about my happiness, And he thinks that this is catastrophic, and that all previous cultural revolutions are such that, there's this dialectic of control and release. And in moments of crisis or cultural revolution, you get sort of two out of balance. And eventually the Cultural Revolution like completes itself by reestablishing a new symbolic order of controls and releases. And that every culture is mostly controls, because like Freud says himself, repression buys civilization, right? That all cultures are defined by by their interdictions, by what is negated, by what can't be done. It's this kind of negativity at the core of it, and we're doing away with the negative altogether, right? That's what our society is an attempt to do. And because of that kind of radicalized permissive orientation and this new kind of therapeutic mentality in which I'm trying to make myself happier, not having any kind of commitment, refusing any kind of commitment therapy. He thinks that we're entering into this new kind of situation where the Cultural Revolution can sort of never be completed, potentially, that no new system of controls and releases can ever be reestablished, that we're just going to be, stuck in an anti-culture forever, just a life with constant, just like surrounded by the piss Christ or whatever. Because we can't have a new institutionalization of controls, a new moral demand system when, we're all just psychological man. And, there's this sort of unending war, anti-culture war against, every kind of control and every kind of repression. Repression always seemed like, when you're analyzing it from the perspective of psychological man, you just see the cost. You always just see the cost because it's all about me and my happiness and my well-being and my self-esteem. And so, you're telling me that I should engage in some kind of ascetic, behavioral regimen. I should restrict my sexual proclivities. I should restrict my drug use. I should do something like that. The only reason that could ever be supplied to restrict my drug use or whatever would have to be that ultimately it makes me less happy, right? That's the only rubric of anything for psychological man. It all just has reference to, if partying all the time somehow is like too much of a burden to me, it kind of wears me out or whatever, then I should party a little less. But there's never any sense of the good. Nothing is inherently good or bad. There's, sexual deviance or whatever isn't experienced as sinful in any way. It isn't that there are forms of relating to other people that are, good, that are inherently good. There isn't any care for the soul, right? As like, in kind of like a platonic sense or something like that. I want to achieve a kind of harmony of my three parts of the soul or something like that. That's all rubbish. There's just, does it make me happy or not? The only reason to restrict my behavior is that it doesn't make me happy, and people, they evaluate interpersonal relationships like that now. They evaluate everything like that. And he's saying that we're running this risk where once we're like that, that there's no way out of it again. There's this metaphor I always that I really liked, that I heard Robert Harrison talking about one time, where you can take a cube and shine a light through it, and it'll, produce a square on the wall, right? Or whatever. But there's no way, contrarily, of getting from a square to a cube. And so, it's like the sacred order, kind of, transcendent constellation of society, has been sort of plumbed out, has been devastated by our anti-culture, by the failure of our cultural elites. And so now we're at the square, and maybe there's no way back again. There's no way to reestablish a moral order. And he thinks that eventually this leads to violence. Just like terrible, barbaric violence. To a kind of war of all against all. We're producing a Hobbesian situation. Because all anybody cares about is their self-interest. And their self-interest is all just, how do I feel? And that's why our politics is like that. This sort of politics of recognition. Anyway, I guess that should be good for now. There's a lot more to this. He says a lot more in here that, it would take a very long time to get through everything interesting that's in this book. And I definitely need to reread it and stuff. But I figured I'd go ahead and talk about it a little bit. And then, I might also talk about like Christopher Lasch and stuff like that coming up soon. But for now, I think it's good that's enough for us to talk about. I hope that was interesting, just as a kind of like little, side project or whatever. I suggest you look into Rieff. I suggest you read Rieff. I think that he's right, that we do live in the age of the triumph of the therapeutic, and that ultimately it's a kind of nihilism, But anyway, don't simply react, but think culture. See you later.